Picture this. It's the year 982 after Christ, and Iceland is getting hammered by storms that old sailors are calling ship-eaters. We're talking about weather so vicious that experienced mariners, men who've sailed through North Atlantic hell for decades, are pulling their boats up on shore and refusing to leave harbour. The kind of storms that turn the sea into a writhing monster of 30-foot waves and horizontal rain that cuts like knives. And there, standing on the black volcanic sand beaches of Reykjavik, is a young man named Bjarni Herjolfsson. He's got calloused hands from years of handling rope and sail, shoulders broad from pulling oars. But what's really interesting about Bjarni isn't his build, it's what he's holding. In his weathered palm sits a crystal about the size of a chicken egg, and he's turning it slowly, watching how it catches light even through clouds thick enough to block out the sun completely. Now, to understand why this matters, you have to appreciate what navigation meant to these Norse sailors. Think about it from their perspective. You're sailing across hundreds of miles of open ocean in a wooden boat that's maybe 60 feet long. No GPS, no radio, no weather satellites telling you what's coming. Your life depends entirely on reading the sun, the stars, the flight patterns of birds, the colour of the water. Miss your target by even a few degrees, and you sail off into the infinite Atlantic to die of thirst while staring at more water than you can drink. Bjarni's father, Herjolf, had sailed west just 3 months earlier, following Eric the Red into exile. Eric, this red-bearded giant of a man who'd been kicked out of Norway for killing people, then kicked out of Iceland for killing more people, had discovered what he called Greenland. And yes, before you ask, he deliberately gave it that misleading name to attract settlers to what was actually a largely frozen wasteland. Early medieval marketing at its finest. But here's where our story gets interesting. When Herjolf left for Greenland, he gave his son some very cryptic advice. Trust the stone, not the stars. The stone he was talking about was what the Norse called solarstein, literally, sunstone. These crystals came from quarries in eastern Iceland, places like Helgustadir, where the miners spoke in whispers about rocks that could somehow see the sun through mountain-thick fog. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like medieval superstition, hold that thought. Because what Bjarni had learned from a trader named Astrid, the Finn woman who exchanged navigation secrets for walrus ivory, was something that would make perfect sense to a modern physicist. He'd learned to hold the crystal up to the sky and rotate it slowly until the light within blazed brightest. That bright spot? It was pointing directly at the sun, even when the sun was completely hidden behind clouds. The science behind this is actually elegant. These calcite crystals are naturally polarizing filters. Sunlight bounces around in the atmosphere and becomes polarized, meaning the light waves line up in specific patterns. Even when you can't see the sun through thick clouds, that polarized light is still there, invisible to the naked eye but perfectly visible to the right crystal. Rotate a calcite sunstone, and when it's aligned with the polarization pattern, it lights up like a beacon, pointing straight at the hidden sun. But Bjarni had taken this further. Combined with his shadow board, think of it as a wooden disc carved with precise angles. Like a primitive astrolabe, he could track the sun's path across the sky even when it was completely invisible. This wasn't just navigation. This was navigation that worked when traditional methods failed completely. So when Bjarni finally decided to sail west to find his father, he was carrying what amounted to revolutionary technology. The problem was, the revolution was about to go very, very wrong. 3 days out from Iceland, storms hit that made the harbour-destroying tempests look like gentle rain. We're talking about the kind of weather that turns experienced sailors into praying men. Waves the size of houses. Wind that screams like the world ending. For 3 days, Bjarni's Nar, a broad-beamed cargo ship, built to haul timber and livestock, got thrown around the North Atlantic like a toy in a bathtub. When the storms finally cleared, Bjarni found himself in waters no Norse sailor had ever seen. The familiar seabirds of the Iceland-Greenland route had vanished. The water had turned a deep, alien blue that meant open ocean. Serious open ocean. His crew of 30 men, hardened sailors, who'd weathered storms that would terrify modern yacht racers, were starting to show real fear. And then, On a morning when the sea lay calm as green glass, Thorstein the sharp-eyed called out from the bow, "Land." But not just any land forests running down to the sea like green, carpets, mountains purple with distance, beaches that gleamed white instead of the black volcanic sand they knew from home. This wasn't Greenland. This was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere no European had ever been. Bjarni raised his sunstone, took careful readings with his shadow board, and made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. They would not land. Think about that for a moment. Here's a man looking at what's probably the coast of Labrador or Newfoundland, the edge of a continent that won't be officially discovered by Europeans for another 500 years, and he decides to sail on by. Why? Because Bjarni was a dutiful son, and his mission was to find his father, not to explore unknown lands. So they sailed north, passing 2 more mysterious coastlines, before finally reaching Greenland and Eric the Red's settlement at Bratalid. Now picture the scene when Bjarni arrives at Eric's great hall. It's harvest time, and about 200 settlers have tinevities gathered for the feast. The hall is thick with smoke from seal oil lamps, loud with the sound of men telling stories and women gossiping. Eric himself sits in the high seat, this legendary figure with his famous red beard, surrounded by his warriors and craftsmen, and the various tough characters who'd followed him into exile. And young Bjarni, probably nervous as hell, stands up to tell his tale. The reaction was immediate and brutal. It started with Ulf the Weatherwise, the leader of the Navigators Guild, essentially the union boss of the 15 established navigators, who controlled all travel between Greenland, Iceland, and Norway. Ulf stood up, pointed at Bjarni, and declared, "This pup claims his pretty rock shows him the sun better than the methods our grandfathers used to find Iceland itself." The hall exploded. Men pounded tables. Women hid smiles behind their hands. The skalds, the poet-entertainers, immediately began composing insulting verses on the spot. And Eric, the Red himself, this man whose opinion carried the weight of law in Greenland, stood up and pronounced judgment. Bjarni was the coward who found 3 lands and claimed none for Norse glory. But here's the thing. The mockery wasn't just about wounded pride or conservative thinking. There was serious money at stake. Those 15 established navigators charged 5 marks of silver to guide a single ship between Greenland and the outside world. 5 marks was serious wealth enough to buy a good farmstead or a herd of cattle. Their entire economic model depended on specialized knowledge, passed down from father to son, carefully guarded secrets that kept them employed and wealthy. If any fool with a crystal could navigate accurately, their monopoly would crumble like old bone, so they fought back with everything they had. They spread rumors that would make a medieval tabloid proud. The Solarstein drove men mad. Shadow boards attracted sea monsters. Anyone who used these new methods would never father children. They made sure Bjarni couldn't get work on any trading ship. They turned him into a cautionary tale, a laughingstock whose very name became synonymous with cowardice and delusion. Bjarni found himself exiled within exile, banned from the very profession he'd tried to revolutionize. The man who'd discovered America 500 years before Columbus was dismissed as a fool who'd confused clouds for land and crystals for wisdom. But here's where our story takes a turn that should give you chills, because 15 years later, a young man named Leif Erikson came looking for the disgraced navigator, and Leif wasn't interested in mockery or conventional wisdom. He was interested in those 3 mysterious lands that supposedly didn't exist. 15 winters. That's how long Bjarni Herjolfsson lived in disgrace before opportunity came knocking at his door. And when I say knocking, I mean literally, because Leif Erikson showed up at Bjarni's isolated farmstead in the middle of the night, accompanied only by his most trusted companion, a German named Tyrkir, who'd served as Leif's foster father. Think about what this moment meant. Leif wasn't just any ambitious young Viking. He was Eric the Red's son, heir to the most powerful family in Greenland, a man who could have had his pick of navigators from the established guild. But here he was, riding through the darkness to seek out the man his own father had branded a coward and a fool. The meeting took place in Bjarni's workshop, a small turf building that reeked of seal oil and pine tar, cluttered with the tools of a navigator nobody would hire. And there, by the light of whale oil lamps, the disgraced sailor revealed secrets that would change the course of history. Bjarni showed Leif everything: how to hold the crystal at exactly arm's length too close, and your hand's warmth affects the reading. Too far and subtle changes become invisible. How to find that perfect point where polarized light creates a bright spot that cuts through clouds like a sword through cloth. The shadowboard technique required even more patience. Placing a wooden gnomon, think of it as a sundial's pointer in the center, marking where shadows fell at precisely noon, creating what amounted to a sun compass that worked regardless of magnetic variation. Now, here's what's fascinating about this exchange. Leif didn't just pay in silver, though he paid plenty of that. He paid in something far more valuable to a man who'd spent 15 years being called a liar. He paid in vindication. Leif purchased Bjarni's ship, the very Nar that had supposedly seen phantom lands, understanding that men would more readily follow a proven vessel than trust an untested one. But Leif's preparation went way beyond just acquiring tools and boats. This man was thinking strategically on multiple levels that would impress a modern corporate executive. He spent months with a woman named Gudrid, the far-travelled, who'd lived among the Celtic peoples of the Hebrides and learned their ancient navigation methods. And here's where our story gets really interesting. Gudrid revealed that Celtic monks had been using crystals they called sunstones of Brendan to navigate to Iceland centuries before the Norse ever arrived. Think about what this means. The Norse weren't the first Europeans to use polarized light navigation. Irish monks, those scholarly warriors who'd established monasteries in some of the most impossible places on Earth, had been reading crystals to find their way across the North Atlantic since at least the 7th century. The knowledge Bjarni thought he'd discovered was actually part of an ancient tradition that stretched back generations. Leif's political maneuvering proved just as crucial as his navigation skills. Remember, this was a time when Christianity was spreading through Norse lands like wildfire, often clashing violently with traditional beliefs. Leif had been baptized by King Olaf Tryggvason himself, a king who'd made converting the Norse his personal crusade. So Leif presented his expedition as fulfilling Christian duty, spreading the gospel to unknown lands, while carefully maintaining enough respect for the old gods to keep his pagan supporters happy. His crew selection was masterful. Thorhall the Hunter brought survival skills learned in Greenland's most unforgiving regions. Thorvald Shields provided combat experience from raids along the Scottish coast. But most importantly, Leif recruited 3 young navigators from the very guild that had destroyed Bjarni's reputation. These men, sworn to absolute secrecy, would learn the Sunstone method and return as Leif's allies in breaking the navigation monopoly that had controlled Greenland's lifelines for decades. When Leif's expedition finally sailed west, they carried Bjarni's detailed notes runes scratched on birch bark describing currents, bird sightings, watercolor, changes, even the smell of the wind at different points along the route. This wasn't exploration. This was following a map written in nature itself. The voyage became the stuff of legend precisely because it succeeded so completely. Using the Sunstone method, Leif could navigate through fog banks that would have scattered traditional navigators like leaves in a storm. When other ships lost sight of each other in the inevitable North Atlantic weather, Leif's expedition maintained formation, his crystal cutting through the gloom to find the hidden sun while his companions floundered in grey uncertainty. When they reached the first land, the flat, stone-covered coast that Bjarni had only observed from a distance, Leif named it Helluland, meaning land of flat stones. But unlike his predecessor, Leif landed. They explored, they mapped, they collected samples, and the sunstone guided them every step of the way, allowing precise navigation along an unknown coast. At Markland Forest, land, the timber resources proved so extensive that Leif ordered his men to cut sample logs. Think about what this meant to Greenland settlers. They lived in a land where wood was so scarce that a good piece of driftwood was worth more than silver. Here was a forest that seemed to stretch to the horizon, full of the kind of straight-grained timber that shipbuilders dreamed about. But Vinland surpassed every expectation. Following a warm current south, guided by sunstone readings that kept them perfectly on course, They found a land where wild grapes grew thick as a man's thumb. Salmon ran in the rivers larger than any Norwegian had ever seen. The grass stayed green through winter, and most remarkably, the sun's path, carefully tracked with their shadow boards, showed they'd travelled farther south than any known Norse settlement. Leif's camp at Leifsbudir became the first European foothold in the Americas, built with the precision that only accurate navigation could provide. They knew exactly where they were in relation to Greenland. They could maintain contact, plan supply runs, even send messages back describing what they'd found. The return voyage carried more than timber and grapes and tales of plenty. It carried revolution. When Leif's ship appeared in Brattaheed's harbour, loaded with proof of the Western land's wealth, the same men who'd mocked Bjarni 15 years earlier now crowded the docks, begging to learn the crystal's secrets. Ulf the Weatherwise, that pompous leader of the Navigators' Guild who'd called Bjarni a fool, suddenly found himself scrambling to maintain relevance as his monopoly crumbled overnight. Young sailors pooled their resources to purchase sunstones from the Helgustadir quarry. Craftsmen who'd carved toy boats for children now found themselves making precision shadow boards for paying customers. Within a single season, the price of passage between Greenland and Iceland dropped by half as competition flourished, like spring flowers after a hard winter. And Bjarni? The man who'd been branded a coward now received marriage offers from wealthy families who'd previously crossed the street to avoid him. Ship's captains sought his consultation. Young navigators begged for his instruction. But perhaps most satisfying of all, he refused those marriage offers with quiet dignity, understanding that vindication earned through another man's courage was still vindication. The navigation revolution was complete. The impossible method mocked in Eric's Hall had opened half the world. But as we'll see in our next chapter, success breeds its own dangers. Because when there's new land to claim and new wealth to harvest, there's always someone willing to spill blood to get their share. And blood, as it turns out, has a way of staining even the clearest crystal. You know what they say about success: it breeds imitation, ambition, and unfortunately, violence. Leif's triumph triggered an avalanche of plenge, expeditions westward, each one trying to claim their piece of the promised land. But here's where our story takes a dark turn, because not everyone who learned the Sunstone secrets had Leif's wisdom or restraint. Take Thorvald Eriksson, Leif's brother. Picture a man with all of Leif's intelligence, but none of his diplomatic skill, quick to anger, quicker to draw his sword, the kind of Viking who gave Vikings their bloody reputation. Thorvald assembled 60 men for his expedition, but from the moment they sailed west, his violent temperament poisoned what should have been peaceful exploration. Now, Thorvald's navigators had pushed the Sunstone method even further than Leif had. Tyrkir, the German, that brilliant foster father of Leif's, had developed techniques for night navigation using moon polarization, essentially reading polarized moonlight the same way they read polarized sunlight. This meant 24-hour navigation capability, the ability to sail through polar nights that had trapped Norse explorers for centuries. Using these advanced techniques, Thorvald pushed deeper into what the Norse called Skraeling territory, the lands of the indigenous peoples. And this is where we need to pause and think about the other side of this story, because the Skraeling's ancestors of the Beothuk and Mi'kmaq peoples had been watching these Norse arrivals with very careful interest. These weren't primitive peoples stumbling around lost in their own territory. They had their own sophisticated navigation methods, counting tidal cycles, reading the flight patterns of Arctic terns, following star reflections in still water. They understood their coastlines with an intimacy that came from thousands of years of experience. When strange men arrived in wooden ships, carrying crystals that caught light, the indigenous observers were studying these newcomers just as intently as the Norse were studying the new lands. The first meetings brought tentative trade. The Skraelings offered furs and ivory goods the Greenland settlers desperately needed in exchange for red cloth and milk. But here's where cultural differences created deadly misunderstandings. The indigenous peoples were largely lactose intolerant, so the milk that Norse considered a generous gift made them violently sick, breeding suspicion and mistrust. According to later Icelandic tales, a young indigenous woman they called Winona showed Norse women how to read weather signs in cloud movements, while Norse navigators demonstrated the sunstone to amazed indigenous observers. For a brief moment, it seemed like genuine cultural exchange might develop two different peoples, sharing their knowledge of reading the natural world. But Thorvald saw rich lands and planned conquest, not cooperation. His mind worked like a medieval property developer. He looked at vast forests and fertile valleys and saw Norse farms, Norse towns, Norse control. When his men killed 8 Skraeling hunters who were sleeping under their overturned canoes, essentially murdering unarmed men in their beds, vengeance came swiftly and precisely. The indigenous response was everything Thorvald's arrogance hadn't anticipated. These people knew their terrain like the Norse knew the sea. They moved through forests silently, struck without warning, and melted away before retaliation could organize. When an arrow found the gap in Thorvald's armor, his dying words captured the tragic stupidity of his approach. "We have found a rich country, but we shall not enjoy it." But if Thorvald's story shows how violence corrupted exploration, the tale of Freydis Eriksdottir reveals how navigation technology itself could be weaponized for murder. Freydis was Leif's half-sister, and she combined her family's intelligence with a ruthlessness that would have impressed Machiavelli. She partnered with 2 Icelandic brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, agreeing to share ships and profits equally in a joint expedition to Vinland. But Freydis had learned more than just navigation from Bjarni's methods. She'd learned that trust in technology could be turned into a weapon. During the voyage west, Freydis gave deliberately false sunstone readings to the brothers' navigator. Think about how diabolical this was. She'd position herself where the other ship could see her taking readings, then signal directions that would lead them into dangerous waters while her own ship found safe harbor. To outside observers, it looked like she was sharing navigation data. In reality, she was committing slow-motion murder. Once they reached Vinland, Freydis claimed the brothers had cheated her, using this manufactured grievance to justify massacre. Her men slaughtered Helgi and Finnbogi along with most of their followers in a night attack that violated every code of honor the Norse held sacred. But Freydis's evil went deeper than simple murder. She corrupted the very tools that had opened the western lands, performing blood rituals with her sunstone that horrified even hardened Vikings. When 5 women from the brothers' expedition survived the initial slaughter, no man in Freydis's crew would kill them not from mercy, but from superstitious terror at what their leader had become. So Freydis took up an axe herself, earning eternal infamy in the sagas, and demonstrating that technological advancement means nothing without moral restraint. Traders later swore that crystals turned black in her presence and gave false readings to anyone who'd shed innocent blood, though this was probably guilt, speaking through superstition rather than actual crystal corruption. The most ambitious attempt at permanent settlement came from Thorfinn Karlsefni, a wealthy merchant who assembled 3 ships, 160 people, including women and livestock, and enough supplies for long-term colonization. His navigators had perfected the sunstone art to an almost scientific level, using multiple crystals for verification, creating detailed charts with shadowboard readings, even training ravens to fly between ships to maintain visual contact in fog. For 3 years, Karlsefni's settlement proved that navigation mastery could support substantial European presence in the Americas. They built permanent structures, established trade relationships, even had children, the first Europeans born in the New World. But superior navigation technology meant nothing against superior numbers and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The Skraeling attacks that finally forced Karlsefni's retreat weren't random violence. They were coordinated military operations that exploited every advantage the indigenous peoples possessed. They knew which beaches offered easy landing, which forests provided concealment, which seasons brought the worst weather. The Norse might have been able to navigate to Vinland reliably, but they couldn't control it against people who'd been mastering its challenges for millennia. The navigation wars peaked when competing Norse expeditions began sabotaging each other's technology. Unscrupulous crystal sellers offered false sunstones that looked identical to genuine calcite, but lacked polarization properties, essentially selling navigation instruments guaranteed to fail at the worst possible moment. Shadowboards were carved with subtle errors that would lead ships miles off course. Pirates learned to attack during the vulnerable moments when navigators took readings, when crews were focused on instruments rather than defense. The Greenland Assembly passed laws making navigation sabotage punishable by outlawry, essentially a death sentence, in a land where survival depended on community cooperation. But enforcement proved impossible on the open sea, where accusations flew like arrows and proof died with the drowned. As the Vinland ventures collapsed in blood and betrayal, they left behind a hard lesson that echoes through history. Technological advantage alone cannot sustain colonization against determined resistance and internal corruption. The same crystals that had opened new worlds became tools of murder and deception. But perhaps most tragically, the violence poisoned the very knowledge that made the discoveries possible. Navigation secrets that should have been shared became closely guarded weapons. Trust between navigators dissolved into suspicion and sabotage. Yet somehow, against all odds, the knowledge survived. And as we'll see in our final chapter, the impossible navigation method mocked in Eric's Hall would eventually find vindication in the most unlikely place imaginable, the space-age laboratories of NASA. The retreat from Vinland didn't end Sunstone navigation, it refined it into something approaching high art. You see, the sailors who'd survived those bloody western voyages possessed knowledge that was literally worth more than its weight in gold. They knew which crystals worked best in different conditions. Clear calcite for bright fog, cordiorite for twilight sailing when the sun hung low and weak. They understood that shadow boards needed different configurations for different latitudes, that navigation in the high Arctic required techniques that would fail completely in southern waters. The Hauksbok manuscript, written around 1300, contained what amounts to encoded navigation instructions hidden within seemingly innocent saga tales. Why the secrecy? Because by then, the Catholic Church's influence had grown strong enough to make openly pagan navigation methods politically dangerous. So master navigators disguised their technical knowledge as entertainment, preserving secrets in stories that could be told around any Christian hearth without raising ecclesiastical suspicion. The economic transformation that Leif had triggered proved remarkably lasting. Iceland developed crystal mining into something approaching modern industrial precision. The Helgustadir quarry didn't just produce navigation stones. It produced navigation stones graded for specific purposes, with master craftsmen who could tell you exactly which crystal would work best for your particular route and season. In Trondheim, Norwegian artisans created shadow boards so precise they could determine latitude within half a degree accuracy that wouldn't be matched by other methods for centuries. These weren't rough wooden discs carved by ship's carpenters anymore. These were precision instruments made by specialists who understood that a navigator's life might depend on the exact angle of a gnomon's placement. The knowledge spread through Norse trading networks like ripples in a pond. Scottish sailors in the Hebrides combined sunstone methods with their own Celtic traditions, creating hybrid techniques that worked particularly well in the brutal weather of the northern Atlantic. Russian merchants in Novgorod used modified versions for navigating the river systems that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea, adapting ocean navigation for inland waterways. But perhaps most remarkably, women played crucial roles in preserving this knowledge, roles that the male-dominated sagas rarely recorded. The tradition of stone mothers, elderly women who taught young navigators to polish and read crystals, persisted through centuries of political upheaval. These women understood that crystal quality could mean the difference between safe harbor and death at sea, so they developed techniques for testing, grading, and maintaining navigation stones that wouldn't be formally documented until modern times. In Greenland's final years, as the climate cooled and contact with Europe dwindled, a grandmother named Sigrid Stormcrow maintained a workshop where she trained the last generation of sunstone navigators. When Greenland settlements finally failed victims of cooling climate, political isolation, and probably conflict with Thule peoples, Sigrid's students carried the knowledge back to Iceland, ensuring that centuries of accumulated expertise didn't die with the abandoned farms. The Catholic Church's relationship with sunstone navigation proved fascinatingly complex. While some bishops condemned crystal reading as pagan sorcery, practical abbots recognized its value for maintaining contact between far-flung monasteries. When you're trying to supply a religious community on some wind-scoured island off the Scottish coast, Theological purity matters less than actually getting the supply ships through alive. The Irish revelation proved particularly significant. The Brendan monks of Ireland revealed they'd been using similar techniques since at least the 7th century, calling their crystals sunstones of St. Brendan and incorporating them into Christian navigation, practices that predated Norse discovery by generations. This led to fascinating syncretic practices, where navigators would pray to St. Christopher while taking crystal readings, blending Christian faith with pagan technique in ways that satisfied both spiritual and practical needs. When magnetic compasses arrived from the East Chinese technology, filtering through Islamic trade networks, conservative navigators resisted with surprising tenacity. They'd seen too many compass needles behave strangely near iron cargo, too many magnetic readings thrown off by storms or proximity to unknown mineral deposits. The sunstone might require skill and experience, but it never lied, never pointed the wrong direction because of some invisible influence. The last documented use of sunstone navigation occurred in 1567, when an Icelandic trader named Sigurd Thorson used crystals to find his way through impossible fog to Bergen, saving his cargo and crew when all other navigation methods failed. As modern instruments replaced ancient techniques, sunstones became family heirlooms, their purpose half forgotten, their significance reduced to curiosities that old-timers would show to grandchildren with tales of the old ways. Then, in 1844, Danish archaeologist Carl Christian Rafn found a crystal in a Viking grave that demonstrated clear polarization properties, sparking the first scientific interest in Norse navigation methods. Suddenly, academics who'd dismissed saga tales as fantasy began wondering if there might be more truth in those old stories than anyone had suspected. The 21st century brought full-circle vindication that would have astonished Bjarni Herjolfsson. Researchers discovered that Arctic bees navigate using polarized light patterns, the exact same principle that Norse navigators had exploited 1,000 years earlier. A 2002 study proved that calcite crystals could determine sun position within 1 degree of accuracy, even in complete overcast, better precision than many modern recreational GPS units. But here's the moment that should give you chills. NASA, the National Aeronautics, and Space Administration studied Viking navigation methods for potential Mars missions. Think about that. The impossible crystal reading technique mocked in Eric the Red's Hall is now being considered for spacecraft navigating between planets where magnetic compasses fail completely and satellite navigation systems might be unavailable. Modern adventure sailors who recreate Viking voyages using authentic sunstone navigation consistently report remarkable accuracy. They find that the 1,000-year-old techniques work exactly as the sagas claimed, guiding them safely across the North Atlantic, using nothing but crystals, wooden instruments, and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of seafarers. The Helgastadia quarry, exhausted centuries ago, has become a pilgrimage site where visitors can touch the rock face that once provided navigation crystals for ships bound to unknown shores. Tour guides tell stories of Bjarni and Leif, of Freydis and Karlsefni, of the brief moment when Norse technology opened pathways to a new world. In Reykjavik's harbour, where Bjarni Herjolfsson once stood scorned and isolated, a modern statue shows him holding a sunstone toward the sky. He's no longer the fool who found paradise and fled, no longer the coward whose tales were dismissed as fantasy. He's recognized now as the navigator whose impossible method opened half the world to European exploration, whose crystal reading technique was so far ahead of its time that it took 1,000 years for science to catch up and explain why it worked. The inscription on that statue reads simply, Bjarni Herjolfsson, first to see the Western lands. But if you know the full story, if you understand how his revolutionary navigation method was mocked, suppressed, corrupted by violence, preserved by secret keepers, and finally vindicated by space-age science, then you understand that statue represents something much more profound. It represents the triumph of innovation over ignorance, the persistence of truth despite persecution, and the strange way that human knowledge sometimes leaps centuries ahead of its time before the world catches up to recognize genius. Bjarni held a crystal to the sky and saw the future. It just took us 1,000 years to understand what he was looking at.